English translation, 637th Contact Tuesday, the 8th of December 2015, 22:34 hours.
Hello, Ptaah, dear friend. Nice of you to come today. Hello and welcome.
Thank you. Greetings, too. It is probably important for you that I tell you how Quetzal is trying to find the right solution to the problem of he will probably visit you next week or the week after and report back to you.
That's good, because if the matter was pending, it would be annoying.
That's what we think. But what I want to say in connection with the general meeting last Saturday, Florina and Enjana have told me that it has run like hardly before extraordinarily harmoniously, which was probably due to the fact that the disturbing factors were neutralized and will not appear again. The negative vibrations that have occurred in recent years, which have gone out and increased to such an extent that a general disharmony has spread, have always created a strain and a disharmonic climate. There is another similar vibration, which comes from outside, but which is in a smaller form than the one that existed before, which was double-shaped, and given. However, the current external situation will be remedied in the new year from January onwards, leaving only two weaknesses but it will be possible to regulate the whole thing, namely,
Reason is a matter of its own, whereas loyalty, in my opinion, has a chance.
That is also my opinion because
I guess so. But can I ask you something about microplasty in Swiss waters? Although we already discussed this at the 603rd official contact meeting about a year ago, namely on the 14th of December 2014, I received a call asking to what extent Switzerland's waters, that is to say the Rhone, Aare, Rhine and Thur rivers, etc., as well as Switzerland's lakes were contaminated with microplastics. It was also asked whether microplasty was actually not harmful to human health, as claimed by the Swiss Health Authority. The animals, the creatures, and the fish, as well as water birds and all aquatic creatures at all, would be damaged in health and even die from the microplasty. In any case, that was said in this or a similar way on the 14th of December 2014 in a conversation between you and me, such as the following, which was quoted.
Microplasty is found as tiny particles not only in the stomachs of shellfish, but it also accumulates in their tissues and body fluids. The consequences of this over a longer period of time are obvious. It is also certain that with microplastics, the other pollutants contained in the plastic, such as plasticizers and solvents, are distributed much more strongly and also impregnate the water. Some of these substances have a hormonal effect, which means that male fish already suffer from increased infertility and hermaphroditis. To top it all off, not only do these pollutants, which are already contained in plastic, contribute to the poisoning of marine life, but also many other waste substances, such as the fact that plastic in the sea acts like a magnet that absorbs water-repellent chemicals. Sea creatures are poisoned with plastic waste, but many have already died and continue to die from other toxic substances. In some marine areas, 6 times more plastic parts swim than plankton, so many sea dwellers eat the plastic. Turtles, for example, hold plastic bags for jellyfish and eat them as well as seabirds that swallow smaller plastic parts floating on the surface. One of the consequences of this is intestinal obstruction, which leads to death. Very many waterfowl strangle themselves if they use plastic cords with the nest construction. Other marine creatures, on the other hand, end up in so-called six-pack rings or in lost fishing nets, which are known as ghost nets. First inventory of microplasty in Swiss waters Bern, 11.12. 2014. On behalf of the FON, EPF Lausanne has investigated Swiss waters for the presence of tiny plastic particles, so-called microplastics. Microplastic particles were detected in most of the samples from the 6 Swiss lakes and the Rhone. Although the measured concentrations pose no direct threat to the environment and water quality, their occurrence in water bodies is undesirable and affects the current prohibition of pollution in water protection legislation.
Now the question, to what extent is microplastic waste present in Swiss waters today, or has it remained the same or increased further? And what about the fact that this microplastic waste should not be dangerous to humans?
The mass has continued to increase in a serious way. With regard to the larger microplastic particles floating in the rivers and lakes of Switzerland, which are particularly dangerous for aquatic life and for aquatic poultry, but less dangerous for humans because these substances do not get into drinking water. The microplastic substances, which must however be measured at the nanoscale and which are particularly present in lakes, rivers, and still waters, can very well get into drinking water and be absorbed by humans. In this way, the tiny particles lead to ailments and diseases that cannot usually be detected by terrestrial chemists, nor diagnosed in their origin by terrestrial physicians. Although these facts are trivialized or even denied by health authorities, chemists, and researchers, these facts are basically given and indisputable, but they are often denied against better knowledge. And it is also a fact that in all Swiss rivers, not only in the quiet waters and lakes, not only microplastics in coarser forms are drifting by, but also plastic nanoparticles, which are harmful to health for all forms of life and may even be life-threatening.
That was to be expected, because also in Switzerland many chemists, researchers, and the health authorities of the population lie the horn full, because they earn a lot of money with it. If they reassure the good believers and somehow fool the people with lies and other untruths, cheat then the food producers, as well as plastic manufacturers and plastic product manufacturers, etc., can operate their business.
I'm afraid so.
But what I actually want to say today is this. At present, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change 21st Conference of the Parties, COP21 for short, is being held in Paris, France, from the 30th of November to the 11th of December 2015, as the 21st UN Climate Conference and 11th meeting of the parties to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol CMP 11 for short. This conference is considered to be of central importance, as it is intended to adopt a new international climate protection agreement as a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. Again, it is of course a climate conference of the world's leaders and other high-ranking leaders, who, as usual, will only speak big words and waffle together the banal, the stupid, and the nonsense, as well as decide on the useless, which will neither bring anything useful to earthly climate, nor to nature, its fauna and flora, nor to drinking water and the health of Earth's humanity. As usual, the decisions will be as stupid and idiotic as ever, because they will result again and again in dangerous emissions being reduced by so many percentages within a certain period of time, usually 20 years. But the quotas set will never be reached. And this is also the case if something is actually done about the emission of emissions which are harmful to the climate, etc., because the objective cannot be achieved by the further increase in overpopulation. In fact, the dangerous emissions released into the atmosphere and nature by the vast mass of humanity are rising in relation to the rising overpopulation. This means that during the period of the agreed emission reduction, on average 20 years, and if something is really done about it, that is not usually the case, emissions will continue to rise as a result of the increasing world population, because during the period of the reduction process, many more people will populate Earth, and adults and adolescents will create new climate-hazardous emissions, such as through the use of newly placed cars and other motor vehicles. Also, in relation to the growing overpopulation, new needs are constantly emerging which are placed on industry and for which Earth is exploited for very many resources, which in general again creates an enormous amount of toxic emissions which destroy the climate and nature as well as their fauna and flora. And if one considers that at the moment the overpopulation of Earth is increasing by about 100 million people per year, and that in 20 years, during which such idiotic decisions of the climate conference organizers are taking place, another 2 billion people will populate Earth, then even a layman can calculate that all the climate decisions of the climate conferences are pure nonsense and absolutely useless. In fact, at the climate conferences, everything possible and impossible is addressed. But above all, square bollocks nonsense with regard to the containment of toxic exhaust gases and CO2 emissions which destroy the climate and nature and which primarily cause the greenhouse effect. But not a word is said with regard to the real problem. So the real evil of climate change is not mentioned with any syllable. Namely, that the overpopulation is to blame for everything in relation to their ruthlessly nature-destroying machinations and nature-hostile mismanagement with their degenerated effects. It is concealed that the extreme and violent climate change and the cause of the destruction of all nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the ever-increasing incidence of physical disabilities, suffering, diseases and epidemics among the people, who suffer more and more from it, are the sole consequences of the degenerated machinations of the existing and still rapidly increasing overpopulation. And the more earthly mankind and with it the overpopulation grows, the worse everything becomes, not only with regard to the climate change and the natural disasters resulting from it, but also with regard to the asocial, criminal, warlike, sectarian, terrorist, and criminal degenerations. Fear, psychopathically caused assassination murders, family dramas, refugees, women's misery in marriages, abuse of women, fear, hatred, child abuse and abuse, wars, mass murders, acts of revenge. Racism, suicide attacks, terrorism, and crimes of all kinds will increase in the future to such an extent that it will become hopeless to want to master all the viciously rampant outgrowths. The enormous mass of the existing overpopulation also means that all evils degenerate more and people become more and more hateful, quarrelsome, insecure, dissatisfied, and unhappy. And they also plunge into pathologically destructive thoughts and feelings, turning into psychophysical ruins with psychopathic degenerations and anti-community behaviors. And the whole evil goes on, because by the further unstoppable growth of the overcrowding earth with millions and billions of humans, also all things in the environment degenerate, like the bad states caused by the mass of mankind. Destruction of nature, fauna and flora, and destruction by masses of toxin abuse, as well as earth resource exploitation and environmental pollution in horrendous way. Also, enormous natural disasters, diseases, sufferings, epidemics and plagues are the result of everything, as well as the degeneration of many people, such as the growing violence and the ever-decreasing willingness to help, crime and crimes, incitement to war, terrorism, family disruption, assassinations and other murders, etc. And by ignoring and misjudging these facts with regard to the effective irrefutability of the reality and the resulting truth, by the climate conference participants and their followers, as well as by the ignorance of the majority of the powerful, the civil servants of the state and the peoples in general, the disinterest, indifference and stupor of the people in this regard is also promoted in general. It is a fact that also by the peoples and thus the people nothing is continuously recognized and nothing is done against all destruction and annihilation, namely because the ignorance and the indolence and carelessness trivialize everything and make it incomprehensible that all evils of the climate change and the destruction and annihilation of nature and its fauna and flora are to be led back only to the degenerated machinations of the overpopulation. So not only the governments but also the peoples and thus the rapidly growing overpopulation are doing everything they can to destroy, if at all efforts made against the worldwide evils. The most important factor here is the enormously rapidly growing mass of overpopulation. Because the more people born and the more people already born reach adolescence and adulthood, the more all kinds of other human needs and desires arise that must be fulfilled. And it is just as clear that in this way, all kinds of Earth resources are exploited and Earth is desecrated, as it is that a tremendous amount of waste is created which is simply disposed of in the great outdoors, and thus pollutes land and water, and makes the land and water creatures sick, infirm and driven to extinction. And the more people populate Earth, the more food must be cultivated, with everything being treated with herbicides and pesticides to promote its growth, to eradicate weeds and kill pests, with the toxins settling more or less also in the food that is then eaten by the people, who in turn are contaminated with the poisons contained in the plants. But there are still many other factors which destroy more and more by the degenerated machinations of the overpopulation and destroy more and more, but this is not thought of. On the contrary, even mad know-it-alls or paid researcher liars claim that everything is only black painting, that everything is not even half as bad, and that climate change and the destruction of nature and the extinction of many forms of life correspond nothing but fairy tales to fauna and flora. If we look at the ever-increasing consequences of overpopulation, it is frightening to see that good and valuable interpersonal relationships have long been a thing of the past. This is because, on the one hand, people have become strangers to one another in their dealings with one another, and, on the other hand, a blatant indifference towards one another has arisen. The honest willingness of people to help one another is also a thing of the past, because for a long time now, everything has been going wrong in every respect and has resulted in human depravity. And this already begins where the personal responsibility for one's own physical hygiene is disregarded, be it with regard to the hands, feet, body, or teeth, etc. Whether it is about disregarding one's own or one's neighbor's well-being, which is rejected, neglected, and trampled underfoot, as well as cultivating a healthy, thought-feel-psych consciousness world, and a good general education. Equally, however, what is degenerate has long since also resulted in relation to good interpersonal relationships, an appropriate love of one's neighbor and all humane behavior, with particular emphasis on modesty, honesty, and righteousness, as well as on the honor and dignity that man would have to give to himself and to his fellow human beings, to life and to all forms of life and to all that exists. Degeneracy begins where man has to make the slightest demands on himself, not where he tries to set off misery, disadvantages, and harm against wealth, prosperity, advantage, profit, and benefit. However, neither the climate conference participants in general, nor the powerful statesmen and other rulers, and those responsible for international affairs think about this, because they do not care about it and do not care about anything. Because their entire world of thoughts and feelings and their senses and aspirations are directed solely towards their own well-being and woe, their profit and their advantages. And those humanly and responsibly minded people who, as people and representatives of the people, are of constant straightforwardness, loyalty to duty, righteousness, honesty, and reliability, stand with their opinions, their knowledge, their ability to act, and their exercise of power on the fringes of the decadent state. People and world leaders, because they have no chance against the show-off power of the greedy to assert themselves with their healthy and good arguments. All those degenerate, arrogant, and blasphemous powers of state and their satellites, not the righteous rulers and politicians, who would be responsible for introducing a worldwide and radical birth control and a necessary time-limited birth stop, speak and decide only nonsense and useless nonsense, because they simply fool about without addressing the real evil of origin. And if they are observed and searched for their intellect, their reason and intelligence, and for their sense of responsibility, then it can be seen that there is not much of it, but only just as much as is evident in the case of half-men and greenbeaks who are still minors. All those state powers mentioned, and their satellites, and this is the majority of the majority among them who have the biggest and stupidest flap, do not yet have an effective life experience, and do not experience life. Nor are they able to perceive the reality of reality and its truth. This means that they do not grasp, and consequently do not understand and cannot judge what the real facts are and how they are handled for the benefit of mankind on Earth. Nature and its fauna and flora, the planet and its climate, and what measures need to be taken and implemented. Furthermore, they are cowards and hide in themselves when it comes to turning to the real truth and openly representing it. The majority of all other state officials, as well as the majority of all journalists and public media makers, act within exactly the same framework with regard to newspapers, journals, television, and radio. These include male and female presenters and editors, etc., who comment on television and radio programs without cowardly having the courage to deal with the effective truth and to openly name it. Unfortunately, however, there are far too many people of this kind, be they irresponsible statesmen or other irresponsible statesmen, journalists, media makers, as well as moderators and editors, who are too ignorant. Abyss deeply stupid, equipped with only very weak intelligence and too cowardly to seek the truth, to perceive it, to see it, to understand it, and to name it publicly. They are cowards not only out of personal inner cowardice, but also because they are afraid of having a different opinion than their peers in office and position. But also because they are afraid of people with different opinions, know-it-alls, and stupid elements who are professionally and socially above them and to whom they are committed in some way. But it is also a fact that the majority of all incompetent state officials, journalists, media workers, commentators, and moderators, due to their lack of intelligence, their lack of interest, and their inability to recognize the real, as well as the lack of understanding and reason, cannot recognize, let alone understand, the reality of reality and the resulting effective truth. Nevertheless, megalomaniacs believe themselves to be luminaries in their field of expertise and, in their delusion of having fed wisdom with shovel excavators and of being able to harass, slander, and make impossible those before the public in every possible and impossible oral or written way, who stand up for the effective reality of the facts, and openly call everything as it really corresponds to the reality of reality and its truth. Especially autocratic, unfit, and dishonest journalists, media workers, and presenters on television and radio feel sublime about the reality of reality and its truth. Consequently, they elevate themselves to self-proclaimed gods of their profession and discriminate and slander those people who are devoted to and represent the effective truth. And they do this by ridiculing those who represent the truth and falsifying their statements in a lying and slanderous manner, in order to create for themselves a gloriole of greatness, intelligence, and omniscience, and to appear omnipotent. In this regard, the bad and unfit of these guilds are equated with the majority of those lousy statesmen and politicians who do not assume their responsibilities, but exercise their assigned office only for the sake of power, prestige, vile mammon, and personal gain. It is those who, by their unjust actions and by their irresponsible behavior, also bring into disrepute, in terms of their reputation, honor, and dignity, those who exercise and cultivate their profession correctly, blamelessly, and conscientiously. And these honorable ones are indeed without doubt honest, good, conscientious, and righteous leaders, politicians, government officials, journalists, commentators, media workers, and presenters, etc., who separate themselves from and are excluded from the utter utterance of evil, and therefore must be respected, honored, and appreciated. On the contrary, however, are the characterless, dishonest, and unrighteous who cannot hide their stupidity even by trying on television or otherwise in public to make clever and serious grimaces, and to give themselves a touch of being educated, which in any case always turns out to be pitiful, and all the more reveals the ignorance, lack of intelligence, and lack of neediness of the person concerned, who wants to give himself more clever and educated than he really is. They are too stupid and too self-opinionated, unable to comprehend that when they come before the public with their ingenuous speeches and naive explanations and suggestions, etc., they make themselves ridiculously ridiculous, and that they reveal in their simple-mindedness and ridiculousness that despite their adult age, they have not yet got beyond the stage of their immaturity, as well as their snot-nosed age, their half-strongness, and their early adolescent greenhorn. They are neither able to recognize nor understand that. They are fooling around stupidly and are cowardly winding themselves around the truth, just as the majority of all public media do, such as newspapers, journals, television, and radio. They all cowardly refrain from expressing or writing the truth that only the existing and still immensely growing and overgrowing overpopulation is the origin of the negative and serious climate change caused by man. It is not effectively understood in any way that the massive overpopulation is the effective causer of the whole of the still relatively small catastrophe, which will, however, in the coming times result in a lasting malignant catastrophe that can no longer be countered by earthly mankind. All the degenerate machinations directed against nature and its fauna and flora, as well as against the entire planet and its climate structure, which destroy everything around Earth by earthly mankind as effects of the exuberant overpopulation, destroy slowly but surely all life bases of all billion-fold life forms of all kinds and kinds. And all this happens only out of the insatiable needs of the overflowing terrestrial humanity, who come out on Devil to satisfy and quench all their desires. Their desires, demands, desires, necessities, indispensabilities, desires in complete insufficiency, exploit the mantle of earth, nature, fauna and flora and water in a form of boundless and irresponsible destruction and destruction. Shafts and tunnels are driven deep into earth and its mantle in order to extract ores of all kinds, rare earths, natural gas, petroleum and coal, etc., in order to satisfy the needs and greed of mankind on earth, and also to make rich the companies and corporations which, on the one hand, plunder Earth's resources and, on the other hand, process the materials stolen from Earth into things for whose possession the majority of all Earthlings greedily hunt. And all these things are many thousands, be it diesel and heating oil, coal, plastic and other plastics, or be it bitumen or thousands of other things. But also in nature and in its fauna and flora itself there is overexploitation, because animals are hunted to extinction or poisoned and exterminated by herbicides, pesticides and thousands of other toxins, just as it happens with countless plants of all genera and species, which are simply exterminated conscientiously and irresponsibly for all times. But not enough, because free nature is completely littered and poisoned by the exuberant humanity on Earth, through which many life forms of all kinds and species die off, are exterminated, mutate or become sick and spread epidemics, etc. And this happens not only on the land, but also in practically all waters, be they springs, streams, rivers, puddles, reeds, oceans, seas, lakes, streams or ponds, etc., because in reality there is nothing left on planet Earth with regard to water that is not contaminated by any poisons, so that the ice masses of the North and South Poles and the glaciers are also affected by it. And that is no wonder, because the garbage of all kinds thrown into the waters and into the landscapes is poisoning these and impairs the land and water life forms, but ultimately also man to death. And this is because, contrary to all lying and all trivializing claims of chemists and other experts bought from poison manufacturing companies, toxins are harmful to health even in the tiniest amounts, cause indefinable suffering and diseases, and ultimately lead to death. But even this is only a small part of the whole of what appears through degenerated measures in connection with overpopulation, because the entire connections are so far-reaching that they can hardly or no longer be surveyed in detail. In the wild, for example, the forests that supply the vital oxygen are cut down for profit-greedy reasons and completely destroyed by profit-addicted forest fires, while fertile fields, gardens and meadows fall victim to human construction mania by being concreted and built over with airfields. Roads, paths, houses, and large buildings are misused as sports facilities and army training grounds. But it is also a fact that due to the wear and tear of Earth's resources caused by the massive overpopulation, in particular diesel and heating oil, petrol, natural gas, and coal, enormous CO2 emissions were and continue to be emitted into the atmosphere. Not only the breathing air, but also the soil and the flora are negatively affected by these and other emissions, as are primarily the climate structures, which change the climate and repulse it with tremendous natural disasters. This is also the case in connection with weather changes in the form of violent heat eruptions and primeval storms, etc., in which the southern and northern hemispheres of Earth are also destructively influenced. Permafrost is thawed everywhere, and landslides and debris flows occur. The thawing of the permafrost also releases enormous amounts of methane gas, which enter the atmosphere and poison it, while megastorms rage over Earth and natural disasters such as floods, volcanic eruptions, and forest fires bring hardship, misery, suffering, and death to people, destroy nature and destroy its fauna and flora. But it is not only the various CO2 and other emissions, which annually reach hundreds of thousands and millions of tons into the atmosphere, into the soil and into the water, as well as into all plants of all kinds, and thereby harm humans and all animals and all forms of life at all. But there are also many kinds of toxins, which are released into the environment by humans of Earth and poison and pollute everything. In particular, It is herbicides and pesticides that are applied carelessly into the fields of agriculture and gardens of horticulture and domestic nurseries, etc., impairing their overall function and causing suffering, disease, and other disadvantages to virtually all forms of life, including human beings. However, drug residues, traces of drugs, hormones, painkillers, and toxins also cause spoilage, with all forms of fauna and flora, as well as humans, suffering health damage or organic and mutational changes. The human being on Earth takes hormone-containing as well as many other medicines, after which 60% of them are later excreted again, which get into the sewage system via the toilet and thus into the sewage treatment plants. There, the wastewater is chlorinated and filtered and then returned to the drinking water. So the poisons and hormones, as well as the drug and medication residues, unfortunately remain in the water and get back into the organism of all life forms. Thus also the farm animals, whose meat man eats again and poisons himself with it. Nevertheless, the poisons and other substances in the water, which get into it through the guilt of man, are classified as harmless by alleged specialists, such as chemists, because they are horrendously rewarded for these lies, false analyses, and fictitious research results. And indeed, according to Ptaah and data, there are no limit values for toxins and other harmful substances that enter the human organism, because even nanoscale amounts of toxins already lead to unfathomable ailments that cannot be diagnosed with terrestrial medical means. 2/3 of the surface of the blue planet Earth is covered with water. But more than 97% of Earth's total water balance is salt water and only 2.5% fresh water. 2/3 of the fresh water, on the other hand, is in the form of ice at the poles and is therefore inaccessible to humans as drinking water. This means that only 1/3 of the world's freshwater supply is available for drinking. Drinking water is the term used to describe all the water that humans use for drinking and cooking, for personal hygiene, and for cleaning dishes and other objects that they use in connection with food. Water, then, which he ingests for the rest of his life without harming his health. Global water consumption has increased more than tenfold in the past 100 years, whereas the population of Earth has only increased 4.7-fold. 2/3 of the world's freshwater consumption is accounted for by agriculture and horticulture. While Europe and North America use 2/3 of their water for industry and households, and 1/3 for agriculture and horticulture, other regions of the world, such as Asia and Latin America, use 80% of their water for agriculture. The increase in water consumption is also due to increasing industrialization and the rising demand of predominantly urban households. In this context, water is referred to in industry as virtual water and is required for the manufacture of products. For example, to produce a 32 megabyte computer chip, about 34 liters of water are consumed and a total of 400,000 liters of water are used for the ongoing production of a car. Water scarcity is one of the greatest problems of earthly mankind, because the supply of fresh water on Earth does not increase, but the demand in relation to the unstoppably growing overpopulation. In addition, the reserves on Earth are extremely unevenly distributed. As a result, well over 1 billion people today already have no access to clean drinking water. In North Africa and the Middle East there is already a water shortage, but there is already a water shortage in Europe, for example in Spain and Italy, and these first signs of a lack of drinking water in European countries will intensify in the next decades. And all this only as a result of the growing overpopulation, the majority of which is in no way concerned with the fact that with its further growth it may eventually extinguish itself in future time. I mean most of it, because a certain part of earthly humanity would probably survive and then perhaps become smarter and keep the number of the world's population within a framework that is healthy for the planet in the future and would also strive to restore and regenerate the largely destroyed nature and its fauna and flora, the climate and the planet itself.
This possibility of earthly population extinguishing itself could possibly become reality within the framework of how you express it.
That's right. But I still have something on my tongue, namely the Islamist State or the IS with its murderer militia. Now it is finally the case that various European states are endeavoring to take military action against the Islamist State. Unfortunately, however, not against the civil war parties or the Assad troops and the insurgents who also produce murders and destruction, whereby, unfortunately, the rule is that only bombardments are carried out in relation to Islamist State positions, while it has still not been understood that ground troops must be deployed. This is especially because the Islamist murderers protect themselves against the bombing attacks by simply disappearing from the surface of the bombed areas and creating underground shelters. Shelters and tunnels meter deep in earth, into which they retreat during bombing attacks and survive so safely. These underground buildings of the IS militias can only be cleaned up by deploying ground troops equipped with all the necessary combat and evacuation equipment and destroying the underground protection systems. The murderous IS militia can only be confronted if ground troops penetrate meter by meter into the building and domestic areas, and penetrate into the underground shafts of the shelters, completely destroying them and eliminating, capturing, and deporting the degenerated IS militia to a safe place for life where they can never return to the society of any country. The murderous militias deserve no pardon, for they are so degenerate that they can never find their way back into a normal and righteous life, and therefore must never be set free again and integrated into society. This, of course, does not suit all false humanists of any color who, in their ignorance and stupidity, are unable to grasp and understand that the IS murderer creatures are so indoctrinated, fanaticalized and radicalized that they are no longer able to free themselves from them and are therefore in any case a great danger to the whole world. But in order to satisfy humanity, respect for man and life, narcotics would have to be used in the fights against the IS or against the degenerated creatures, and the murderer militia would have to be put out of action, in order to then capture the IS militia murderers and send them into lifelong exile, and that, as I said, to a place where they cannot be given the opportunity to return to human society. This is precisely because in their degeneration, no pardon is appropriate for them, and this group of murderers cannot be reintegrated into society. Of course, in the fight, as is the case with every warlike fight against the Islamist State, also human lives will be harmed, which unfortunately is unavoidable on Earth in war and terrorist fights. But in the case of the murderous Islamist State, this is not possible otherwise, because the more it gains ground, the more completely all states of Earth become endangered. So if unneeded citizens and dubious politicians and state greats as well as false humanists are against fighting missions against the Islamist State, or even protest against it publicly because they are just stupid and in their simplicity irresponsible and short-sighted, then they endanger the order and peace of their own state and people, and even millions or even billions of people all over the world. The IS strikes in any country in which it finds a way to do so, be it directly in its mass or through individual assassins or groups of sleepers or directly acute IS envoys. The truth is that the Islamist State is absolutely vicious, murderously degenerate, and addicted to world domination, and that its mass murderers and destroyers cannot be reintegrated into a normal human life and re-socialized. Resocialization is based on the assumption that the offender, by his act, places himself outside society, or at least manifests himself in this form, that he is not integrated into society to the necessary extent. The aim of social rehabilitation must therefore be to reintegrate the perpetrator into society, which, however, would be virtually impossible for the multiple murderers of the Islamist State, because they have fallen into a hopeless fanaticism of murder and destruction, etc., which they can no longer bring under control and free themselves from. Well, the fight against the Islamist State, but also the fight against the civil war parties in Syria and the Assad troops and insurgents would have to be led by an international military fighting community, whereby the only right way would be a multinational peace struggle force, in which all non-neutral states would have to be included. States, however, which are classified as neutral, should of course be exempted from such a multinational force as well as of course from any weapons or combat operations and arms supplies, but they should be obliged to provide medical aid in the form of Red Cross, as well as to guarantee a peace-raising and socially active contribution. So far, only the Russian head of state Putin is to be mentioned, who is apparently clever and also willing and far-sighted enough to think at least of an international military community in relation to a neutralization concerning the Islamist state IS, even if not of a multinational peace struggle troop. In the Western world, he therefore seeks for such participation and assistance. But this is obviously rejected by the idiotically anti-Russian Western rulers and not even publicly brought to a clear discussion. In this way, the Western statesmen in power are not only stupid, but above all self-opinionated and especially irresponsible, because they put their hostility towards Russia and their hatred for Russia above all security, whereby they are not able to effectively justify both, but only comment stupidly on them. This stupidity with the state powers concerned, and it is only these, not the righteous, who are meant of the Western countries, and in particular with the EU dictatorship, corresponds to their lack of awareness, understanding, and reasonableness. However, this applies to various powers of the state around the world, with the US powers playing the most inglorious role. But what Putin is not yet striving for, a multinational peace struggle force according to the Hennig system, that can still become, perhaps from him or through another clever statesman of some country that has reasonable and far-sighted government forces. The USA and the EU dictatorship can probably be excluded, because these state structures are controlled by naive, stupid, and adolescent pathological self-stinting as well as abnormal, extreme, pathological, excessive, and excessive power ideologues. They all lack the necessary humanity and effective political calculation with regard to realpolitik or political calculation, planning, calculation, estimation, reflection, and foresight. Of course, among these power ideologues, there are also few reasonable ones who also have more or less humanity and reason and also other good values. But as non-major ideologues, they have no chance and possibility in their government positions to assert their opinion and reason. They then hold back their opinions and simply adapt their behavior to the big-mouthed and right-minded as well as the rulers. Or they duck and let themselves be turned upside down by the others on their convictions and ways of acting and behaving.
What you say with regard to the Islamist State, its fight and the capture and banishment of the IS militia, that corresponds to pure reason. And also what you say about Putin's plan, that corresponds to what is actually given and is also a fact of his reason, contrary to the state powers of the Western world, who reject his idea, effort, and will to cooperate with Western forces. This because, as you say, they have been hostile to Russia since time immemorial out of pure stupidity and cannot separate themselves from the old image of the enemy.
It may well be the case that what I have said about the fumigation of the IS militia, which must be without pardon, falls into the wrong collar for the sectarians and false humanists, so they will insult me as unhuman and inhuman.
This will be the case, because the stupid and naive false humanists and religious sectarians, and they are effective in one case or another, follow a humanly completely degenerated body of thoughts and feelings, and in their delusion in this regard are neither able to see nor grasp the reality of reality and its truth, nor to understand it. So they also do not understand that you are very well prepared against every act of violence, war, terror, and coercion, and against such acts and behaviors you raise the scepter of condemnation, but that you nevertheless advocate in matters of murderous IS militia and demand that a form of logical violence be used, whereby life can very well be endangered or extinguished. To this, I must take the hard word and say that the intelligence of the stupid and naive false humanists is so poorly developed that their reason fail, and they therefore insult you on the one hand as fickle and on the other hand as ambivalent. Precisely because their entire ratio is not sufficient to recognize and understand the reality of reality and its truth, let alone to be able to comprehend it. It does not matter whether these false humanists, stupid and ignorant people, have a good or bad education, whether they are a plebeian assistant or are named with an academic title. So the stupid and the ignorant, who are addicted to religious sectarianism or false humanism, as you have said, will accuse you of barbarism, bestiality, cruelty, inhumanity, lack of compassion and ruthlessness, etc., because if they were on their own and did not have all the fellow humans and communities with whose help and protection they live, they would not be viable. It is the mentioned false humanists, stupid and ignorant, who do not understand that no pardon can and must be shown for the murderous creatures of the Islamist State, because they are so inhumanly degenerate that they never again lead an orderly and murder-free life and can therefore, under no circumstances, be integrated into a regulated society or other group of human beings. If that were done anyway, sooner or later they would give free rein to their murderous and destructive actions.
That is the way it is, because if you do the right thing, then the know-it-alls, who are usually stupid and naive and condemn the right thing that is done, come to the bottom of earth. This also happens in politics, because if a reasonable statesman demands the right thing and does not draw level with the unreasonable other statesman, then he is judged to be agitating. Inciting, inflammatory, provocative, and cold set, just as he is also insulted as not capable of concordance or not capable of a common agreement in a matter. And when I think of the crap that the former Swiss federal councillor Lohenberger recently said on television, that politics is made out of gut feeling, then I am horrified for those rulers who, as righteous in the government, probably have no chance of expressing their own opinions and ultimately of asserting them. I think it is therefore not surprising that the Swiss government has godfathers who judge and who act and who rule on the basis of gut feeling rather than reason, but who, as traitors to their homeland, want to sell Switzerland off to the EU dictatorship and turn Swiss citizens into EU dictatorship slaves.
Everything you say, unfortunately, corresponds to the stupidity and naivety of all those who are addicted to know-it-all. And the fact that a former federal councillor talks so stupidly that politics is decided on the basis of gut feeling is more than just regrettable and says more about simplicity than might be justifiable in politics. It really cannot be that politics is handled and conducted according to a gut feeling, rather than according to reason with regard to the corresponding facts.
But the man actually said it on TV, like I mentioned.
That was probably the case if you say so. And deciding and acting according to a gut feeling instead of reason is not only very regrettable and simple-minded, but it must also never appear in this way. Contrary to this, I find the article written by Brigitte, which Florina recorded for me, exceptionally good, full of intellect and reason, and I wish that it be prepared for an A5 free brochure and handed out to visitors in the center and at information stands.
Thoughts about active euthanasia by own and foreign hand. Is it worth missing dying?
In the last years, when my mother was still alive, I spent as much time as possible with her, because she was sick and frail and could not cope alone anymore. Once, Father had to go to rehabilitation after an operation. I took 3 weeks vacation to be with her. I found the time with her alone a great gift. I was so happy to be with her, just the two of us. I knew that she would not have unlimited time left. These days and nights belonged only to us, and they enabled me to say goodbye to my mother very gradually, knowing that she would be granted it if she left the temporal behind. She had been a persistent and brave fighter all her life, and she remained so throughout her years of increasing infirmity. An event during these 3 weeks remained in my vivid memory, and still today conjures a smile of tenderness, love, and gratitude on my lips and in my heart. It was early in the morning when I got up and went into her room to see if she was already awake. She opened her eyes and stretched and lolls with a deeply happy sigh. "Good morning, dear mother. Have you slept well? How do you feel?" "Thank you, I slept wonderfully and I'm so well. All pain, all suffering was out of strength in that moment. It was simply a moving, silent radiance of great gratitude and perfect happiness. This incident and many similar incidents with other people often come to mind when I hear or read about discussions about the increasing popularity of active euthanasia, mortality tourism, and the workload of the current 5 euthanasia organizations in Switzerland. Dostoevsky once said, "I fear only one thing, not to be worthy of my torment." A person who throws away his life prematurely because he is afraid of suffering, pain, and dependence can hardly claim to be worthy of his agony because he simply does not allow it. But whom he deprives himself and his neighbours of, he has no idea of in his ignorance. And since as a nurse I have seen very many people die, I know what I am talking about and that it is quite possible to prove oneself worthy of life, of dying and of death if one perseveres to the end. In fact, I have hardly ever met a seriously ill person in my career who would have seriously wished for and demanded premature death. These discussions usually take place when you are still in good health and do not even know what it is like when you only have a few days, weeks, or months left. Or they are relatives who want to spare their neighbour another suffering, although they cannot know whether the sick or dying person has another kind of quality of life even in his frail condition, and what it looks like and feels like, because it is completely impossible for them to put themselves in his place. Perhaps they want to spare themselves the sight of the sick, shy away from further costs and demanding care, or even worse, they want to get their hands on what they can do faster. In any case, however, it is understandable and not to be dismissed that a more or less strong pressure, consciously or unconsciously, can be built up in the person directly affected, to which he then supposedly voluntarily submits. The most beautiful thing that can happen to a human being on his longer or shorter last way are fellow human beings who take care of him and make his suffering bearable, care for him and understand his wishes and needs, and fulfill them as far as possible, of course in addition to the beneficial aids of palliative medicine. What else are we human beings for if not to help our fellow human beings in difficult times? In fact, any discussion on this subject would be superfluous if we humans were to meet each other lovingly, respectfully, and empathetically in life and death. It is truly the only thing we need on our last journey. And it is not that the whole thing is a one-sided thing, because like everything in life, it is a giving and taking that makes both sides rich and fills life with meaning. But what really moves me to use myself against a medically sanctioned or other suicide is the fact that dying is simply part of life in view of the fact that this life is not our only one. Again and again we are classified into new incarnations, and every life, including dying, enables us to new important insights for the future existence and all future incarnations. It is much more far-sighted than to leave early, to enable oneself to face suffering in order to gradually better cope with future difficult situations. The meaning of life lies not only in enjoyment, in active activity, in beauty and chandelier filling, it also lies in gaining value from difficult and most difficult days, even if one has to struggle for it every day anew. One should not ask oneself, what do I still expect from life? But what does life still expect from me? To persevere to the end is true greatness, dignity, and self-determination in the truest sense of the word. Let me insert here a short excerpt from the stirring book of the Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist Viktor Emil Frankl. and still say yes to life. A psychologist experiences the concentration camp, which he had written in 1945. Viktor Frankl is also the founder of logotherapy and existential analysis' Third Viennese School of Psychotherapy. In his work, he placed the question of meaning at the center of his work on suicide prevention. See also the YouTube video and still say yes to life. When I read such words of suffering suffered and bravely borne, a debate about active euthanasia seems grotesque to me. In the evening of this fast day, we lay together in our earth hut in a particularly bad mood. Only little was spoken, and when it was, every word was irritated. Then another thing happened. The light went out. The mood reached a low point. The block eldest, a clever man, improvised a little chat about everything that occupied us all inwardly. He spoke about the many comrades who had died in the last days as sick people or as suicides. He also spoke about what might have been the true reason for dying, both one way and the other, giving oneself up. Our block elder now wanted to hear some explanations about this and about the question of how to somehow save the probable next victims of the deadly inner self drop from it. And he apostrophized me. God knows, I was nothing less than in the mood to give psychological explanations, or to give my barrack comrades sole medical encouragement, as it were, medical pastoral care. I was freezing and starving, and I was also weak and irritable. But I had to get my act together and take advantage of this unique opportunity, because encouragement was now more necessary than ever. So I began by saying that the future must seem bleak to every impartial. I admitted that each of us could casually figure out how small the probability of survival was. There was still no epidemic of spotted fever in the camp, and yet I estimated my chances of survival at about 5%. And told the people, because I also told them that I, for my own person, did not think of giving up hope and throwing the shotgun into the grain. Because no one knows about the future, no one knows what might bring him the next hour. And even if we should not expect any sensational military events for the next day, who could know better than we do with our camp experience that suddenly some great opportunity arises, at least for the individual, an unexpected classification into a small transport to a Sonderkommando with particularly favourable working conditions, or the like, things that make up the longing and the highest happiness of a prisoner in a camp. But I was not only talking about the future and the darkness in which she was fortunately shrouded, and the present with all her sufferings, but I was also talking about the past, all her joys and the light that she still gave into the darkness of our days. I quoted the poet who said, "What you experience, no power in the world can rob you." What we have realized in the fullness of our past life, in its fullness of experience, this inner richness can no longer take away from us anything and nobody. But not only what we experience, also what we have done, what we have ever thought great, and what we have suffered, all this we have saved into reality once and for all. And even though it may have passed, it was secured in the past for all eternity. For being in the past is also a kind of being, perhaps the safest. And then I finally talked about the variety of possibilities to fill life with meaning. I told my comrades, who lay there very quietly and hardly moved, at the most they could hear a moved sigh from time to time, that human life always had meaning under all circumstances, and that this infinite meaning of existence also included suffering and dying, need and death. And I asked these poor devils, who listened attentively to me here in the pitch-dark barrack, to look me in the face of the things and the seriousness of our situation and still not to despair, but in the awareness that even the hopelessness of our struggle could not harm its meaning and its dignity, to preserve its courage. On each of us, I told them, in these hard hours I see someone with a demanding look down on us, a friend, a woman, a living person or a dead person, or a God. And he expects us not to disappoint him and not to suffer poorly, but proudly and to die, without meaning he did not want to suffer and die. But without meaning, we all did not want it. And to give this last meaning to our life here, in this camp barrack and now in this practically hopeless situation, that was the effort of my words. I soon learned that this effort had reached its goal. Soon the electric pair lit up on a beam of our barrack, and I saw the miserable figures of my comrades, who now limped up to my place with tears in their eyes to thank me, but that I all too seldom had the inner strength to swing myself up to such a last inner contact with my fellow sufferers as on this evening. That I certainly had not used so many opportunities to do so shall be admitted here. The shocking human greatness that speaks to us from the contents of this book could give some of us reason to reconsider with shame the idea of wanting to leave life prematurely in order to avoid suffering. It is a testimony of great humanity, which even today is able to raise up many who have to suffer senselessly. It raises no pity and no accusation, nor is it at all about the sensation of horror. What matters to the psychiatrist is to describe through which phases of dehumanization the concentration camp, prisoners of whom he was one, had to go, and how some of them were able to say yes to life anyway and give it meaning in all that misery. A person who knows about the fact of the rebirth of his spiritual form can no longer recognize any sense in a suicide, in active euthanasia, or an aid to it. He has learned that man can never avoid self-responsibility, and he is aware that premature separation from life, in whatever way, cannot be a solution to any problem. He must overcome all challenges on his path of life out of himself, through the power of his mind, his reason, and his consciousness. A cowardly escape from life postpones his problems, but he cannot solve them. The following personality of his spirit form line must process the impulses hitting it. Simply explained, this means that if we do not face a problem by escaping from life, our successors will sooner or later be confronted with the same problem again, and it may then be even more difficult to solve the same problem with decency. This has nothing to do with a karma that only corresponds to an earthly fantasy product. Also, active euthanasia is murder, aiding and abetting murder. Suicide is also murder-suicide. In contrast to passive euthanasia, which can be permitted and even correct if, for example, life-supporting machines are switched off after successful and proven brain death, and they only maintain the function of the organs. Life is a wonderful gift. It was not given to us to throw away when it gets hard. So let us use it until the last moment to evolve, and in this way thank creation for it.
Always be grateful to creation, the heavy weaves into your life, for you can never become wise without a fight, and never be happy undeserved. Wednesday, the 1st of November, 1978, 2146 hours. Simyase, Silver Star Center. Billy Bridget Keller, Switzerland.
That's fine.
Then what has been said so far should be enough for today, because I still have urgent things to do. If you have nothing more to talk about, I want to go.
No, I have no questions, and I have nothing more to say right now. Then farewell, my friend. Goodbye.
Goodbye, Edward.